Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
My name is Cody.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
Today we're going to be discussing chapters 31 through 33 of Bleeding Edge. We're finally all four of us together again. It's been quite a while since that happened. Yeah. We've had a number of very interesting, scheduling stuff happen over the course of the last, 2 months of this podcast. But despite all that, we've made it through really well. What did we think of these chapters, everybody? General thought.
I thought they were fine. There wasn't anything particularly in these three chapters that really stuck out in such a way that I, kind of mulled on it for a long time. There was a lot of little things here and there that that kind of, sidetracked me as far as going off into a little bit of a rabbit hole to, learn more about whatever was being referenced. But
yeah, you read an academic paper on.
I did. Well, most of it. Most of it. I don't have that kind of time. It's not that long though. Yeah. But yeah, there was a few things here and there that I thought were interesting. Most of chapter 32 is just various conversations between Maxine and other characters. And then there's some really interesting parts I thought in chapter 33. A lot of it just kind of after the last three chapters, which were really, really heavy. I think it was a nice little slowdown of the pace and a minute to, as a reader, kind of catch our breath and just kind of start tying some things together, and as far as the plot and letting the characters kind of experience and deal with the reverberations of everything that happened in the previous chapters.
Yeah, Luke, Will, what about you guys?
Yeah, I agree with Cody in that these aren't the most eventful chapters, not the most important chapters to the overall plot arc. There's some cool stuff though. I did like, Maxine's journey into Deep Archer was interesting. I always love those sections of this book. It reminds. I never really got on Second Life or anything. I'm really familiar with it from The Office in terms of the specifics of it. The Office, as in the show. But that kind of stuff has always vaguely interested me, and I like that part. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's just not the most eventful. These the chapters are perfectly fine. Kind of a bit slower, but still pretty fun to read. Just not incredibly fun to read.
Yeah, I don't disagree about any of the plot value or thematic development necessarily, but I just do find this a very fun part of the book. I love kind of watching the all of the aftershocks, so to say, have settled, and everybody is kind of readjusting to this new world they're in post 9/11. And while you can tell that everyone's still a little bit shaken up and things are still working their way through, I just find it really interesting to see how these characters kind of reestablish their normal routines.
Or at least some semblance of them. They're not quite the same for sure.
Absolutely, but you know, it feels like a brave new world, very, very much so, I guess. But it is also, back to the everyday. It's not an emergency anymore, and people aren't acting like it is.
Right.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I think there's a return to normalcy, but it's a new normal that everyone is still kind of getting used to. Just a new way of everything fitting. That's just different. It's just going to take some time to really get acclimated to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, too, especially if you read some of the oral histories of 9/11, particularly some of the stuff that came right afterwards. So a lot of people would talk about how the hardest thing to adjust to was just those buildings not being there anymore.
Yeah.
Just suddenly, your entire understanding of the landscape around you has changed in a very dramatic fashion, because those towers were very large, very tall, very imposing in their actual architecture. And to just have that suddenly deleted from the skyline is really probably quite jarring to experience if you've been living there for a while. I really like these chapters, actually. I think that it is, to sort of what Will said, people adjusting to this new normal that they're living in. But to Luke's perspective with going down into Deep Archer, there's a lot of stuff in that section of the book that made me just sort of like go down a rabbit hole of cross references to his other books. Like there's one line in particular that I wrote like 3 pages of notes on afterwards. and I like looked over at my girlfriend and I was like, does this sound like the ramblings of a madman? And I just like read out the notes. She was like, well, I don't entirely know all of the context because I haven't read all of his books yet, but like it sounds completely coherent to me. And I was like, okay, good. So I'm not insane. Yeah, so I think that like there is as a series of chapters of just sort of like digesting a catastrophe, I guess is the way that I would put it. It is really interesting to watch how that gets analyzed by different characters in this book. The opening scene with Sean and then the stuff in Deep Archer certainly being my favorite of these 3 chapters. And also the depiction of what Gabriel Ice is wearing to a bar, which his wardrobe just continuously is very shocking.
He hasn't reached Eric Outfield levels of fashion yet, though, but he's approaching it.
I don't know. He's wearing a lime green blazer when he goes into that bar with Ian Longspoon.
Yeah, but he doesn't have any remotes on him. He's not,
That's true.
He's a few steps behind, but he's getting.
Yeah, he has that level of cool where carrying remotes around is a good choice. Any overall thoughts on the book before we get into chapter 31?
Not particular. It's weird that we're almost done. Like we're in the final kind of third of the book at this point.
We are. Yeah. Yeah. Has anyone's like opinion changed about this book as we've gone through, as we're getting close to the end here, or any like thoughts about how sort of maybe your perspective is shifted from where we were at?
I can certainly say I am enjoying it more than I had previously. Not that I didn't enjoy it previously. It just wasn't. And I don't even want to say it's not it's at the bottom of my list. It just wasn't one that I really gave a lot of thought and time to. And I think doing this, partially because we're really slowing down and really dissecting it is helping with that. But there's something about it. Especially Maxine is growing on me more and more as one of my favorite Pynchon characters in general.
Yeah, she's great.
She's just the more and more I really spend time with this book and really dive into it, the more I really appreciate her and his. I think this is maybe, and I might come back on this when we get through a couple other books, but this might be his best character work. Maybe I'm not 100%. I don't want to commit to that statement just yet, but I think some of the characters in this book are among his absolute best.
Yeah, I would say Maxine is probably his best protagonist, certainly.
Yeah, I'd feel pretty comfortable agreeing with that.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I said something. I don't know if it's really controversial in the wider scope of Pynchon discourse, but it was definitely controversial amongst us hosts at the beginning of the book, saying that it was close to the bottom of my personal taste rankings of Pynchon's novels, and that has definitely changed. I would definitely, I'm not gonna go through and give a list or anything, but I'd bump it up a couple places because I think I said it was like my second least favorite, and that's not fair.
I believe that is what you said. Yes, yeah, because V is your least favorite.
Yep.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate, a way big gap between those two, like between it and V. But no, I think in hindsight, I'm enjoying this a lot more than I enjoyed Inherent Vice, and I have to agree, the character work is fantastic. I don't know if Maxine is necessarily a more well-developed character than say Charles Mason, but it is there are a lot more characters who are a lot better fleshed out than most of Mason and Dixon's. So in that specific realm, I'd say this is some fantastic character development throughout the entire book.
Yeah, agreed.
still holding firm on my assertion that I don't think it counts as a quote unquote replacement for the biblical interpretation of gravity's rainbow. But that's a very silly discussion to have in the first place.
That's fair. Yep. I'm comfortable with your description of it as a New Testament. Gravity's Rainbow's Old Testament. Anyway, so without further ado, chapter 31 opens with another visit to Sean's office, and this time they actually have somewhat of a productive conversation as opposed to most of the previous visits. There's a lot of really, really good stuff in here. I think particularly this line early on page 338, where he says that he compares the World Trade Centers to the Buddhas that he talked about at the very first visit that Maxine had at his office in the book, where he says the World Trade Centers were religious too. They stood for what this country worships above anything else. The market. Always the holy fucking market. A religious beef, you're saying? It's not a religion? These are people who believe the invisible hand of the market runs everything. They fight holy wars against competing religions like Marxism, against all evidence that the world is finite, this blind faith that resources will never run out, profits will go on increasing forever, just like the world's population, more cheap labor, more addicted consumers. And it just sort of, it's in 2013 when he wrote that line. And certainly, did sort of begin that late stage capitalist hellscape that we now live in. That was really the beginning of the top of that slippery slope, and it has gotten significantly worse. And I do love that quote, how it operates synergistically with Maxine's conversation at the office of the intensely true member of the deep states and of that WASP apparatus, where he says the grand old party of today is not what it used to be. It used to be that you just kind of gave someone a favorable contract and you looked the other way when the money showed up, and now it's just everything is infinite. There's nothing finite. Let's screw the future in favor of modern profit. It's interesting that you get the same perspective from somebody inside and outside of that system, that understands that it is a failing system that is ultimately going to kill everybody involved, but that capital T, those powers that be, just require that, as he then puts, tithe back to the dark gods of capitalism, which is one of my favorite quotes in anything Pynchon has written. It's just such a perfect description of what something like this is or would be. Just that this strange dark money ritual to appeal to some sort of foreign evil that is kind of pervasive through the entirety of the economic system that America sold its soul for.
Yeah, and the opening of this chapter is really interesting. There's a lot of I forgot to mention this in our kind of general overlook at these chapters, but there's a lot of conversations that take place specifically in this chapter and in 32 that are kind of the full circle completion of conversations from earlier, this being the first example of that. But I think what Sean is getting at here is really important, not just in that the towers and what they represented, but also this is where we start to see and this has been a recurring theme throughout a lot of Pynchon's work, is that you have these moments in history that are a major shift, and they are utilized by as we get later and later in history, the government starts to utilize these moments to really kind of take advantage of the situation and be able to prey on the fear and the confusion that is existing around what has happened, to kind of further whatever agenda it is that they're working towards. And we saw that happen almost immediately after the attack, and there was a lot of people talking about that in the aftermath of it, and a lot of just kind of brushing that concept under the door of oh well, that's not gonna, the government's trying to help us, and they're going to do this and this and this. But I think this is now 12 years after the event, this is Pynchon looking back and this is where it starts, and everyone, we can start seeing the those shadowy fingers start to kind of get a hold on things now.
And that's why I like that Hunter S. Thompson piece that we
Mhm.
did the reading for in that bonus, because that guy called it the week it happened.
Yep.
He was like, yeah, they're gonna sell us a whole crock of shit, talking about how they're here to protect us and that they're gonna do all sorts of things that are gonna, make the nation safe or whatever. But it's just gonna be, a segue to an endless war without borders, and then you have an endless war. There's no way to win it. You control it. You keep the money machine rolling. It's exactly what fucking Dwight D. Eisenhower warned the nation about when he left office.
Yep.
Yeah, and just in the case that anybody's listening and hears or reads this talk about the Marxism versus capitalism framed in those senses and thinks, oh, this is a bunch of leftist nonsense. Even if you ignore that economic interpretation, you have to remember back in like 2001, 2002, everyone was talking about, oh, they hate us for our freedom. They hate us because we let women walk around without burqas. Like it was all framed in terms of a religious debate, even if you don't think of capital as a deity.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, capital as a deity and as that being a stand-in for a religious framework does certainly jive with the usage of the Hawala money trading that she's desperately trying to trace earlier in the book.
Yeah.
Like you can directly tie capital to actual religious institutions if you want to. Like it's not hard to do. Why else, are WASPs white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? There's always something with those institutions that's tied directly back into power and control of things.
Well, that to be fair might have had more to do with keeping the Polish and the Italians out of power, but same difference.
Yeah, there is always the race angle of it as well, which means nothing in the modern world, especially against different flavors of white people.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting that Pynchon mentions the invisible hand of the market, because that does come up in Gravity's Rainbow. I believe pretty early on, I think during the first seance scene in the first section. I'm struggling to kind of formulate my thoughts on kind of connections between the two. So in Gravity's Rainbow, he's more talking about how we've moved past the invisible hand of the market and how the market is like, I have the quote up, let me look. It says the market creates itself its own logic, momentum, style from inside. And then it also talks about putting the control inside as ratifying what de facto had happened. He would dispense with God. So I mean, I think part of what Pynchon could be talking about here, and especially in relation to that quote from Gravity's Rainbow, is that like capitalism and our obsession with money is kind of superseded and taken over. Like where once we were a very puritanical and religious country, now we more worship wealth and money than we actually worship any particular religion.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, that's 100% spot on. There's another interesting line here that like drove me into a bit of a mental rabbit hole that I was kind of wrapped around the axle about for a while, where later on where it says, yes, but now another. You'd have to say insane suspicion has begun to bloom in all the California sunshine around here. It's that usage specifically of California sunshine, where through the book, California has been repeatedly characterized as this evil empire that has just the evil of sort of the United States is coming out of there through, Sand Hill Road and through the venture capital system and through the Silicon Valley and how that transmitted over to the Silicon Alley. And especially, I think what really like struck me about this, as we've talked about those California as evil empire moments in the book, is the fact that, in the just preceding chapters, there's all that conversation of just everyone's kind of retreating into themselves and acting like infantile. Everyone's like regressing into, childish sort of thoughts or feelings or behaviors. And, I think that as an outgrowth of that, as time would go by, that trauma that was inflicted on a nation, as we talked about, how you can get PTSD through just like footage or photos, and that's why drone pilots have such high rates of it. That what happened is a lot of these people in their retreat back into childish impulses or innocence writ large, they retreated into products given to them by the evil empire of California. that
Mhm.
as time went on, it was consumer technology, and then eventually in the modern era, it was social media. And that's what everybody's on all the time. It's a constant, sort of downward angle of your neck at your phone as you look at Twitter, you look at Instagram, or you watch YouTube or whatever, and that keeps you in that sort of strange mental headspace of delaying thinking about serious things because of that instant gratification that it provides. And I feel like a lot of that started here because you get glued to the television as you watch the footage of the towers burning for days and days and days and days and days, and then all of a sudden you're left with this trauma response of it, especially when you're living in New York and you seek out anything else to push away those feelings. And um, you know, these abnormally young people that she brings up is what sort of prompts this California sunshine remark. And it just seems to me that, like, potentially, if I was to stretch the meaning of it, maybe this is a strange conspiracy corner thing. He's getting to the idea that, like, yeah, this opened up the whole world to the evil that was coming out of California, and it's now just sort of pervaded throughout the air. To where everything is sunshine and roses, just like it's supposedly out in Hollywood land, and instead it's just that we're all invested in the technology that comes out of there and how that has shaped the modern world that we live in.
I don't think that's terribly far-fetched. I mean, that was a lot of what Vineland was getting at, was that,
Yeah.
that sort of darkness that was looming on the westernmost part of the country, and even Mason and Dixon too. The further west they go, the darker things get, and that there's always that kind of looming presence, in the furthest westernmost part of the country. So,
Mhm.
and yeah, that is, there has always been that glamorized California sunshine, um, that's been portrayed to us, but then there's always been at the same time that dark underbelly that exists underneath all of that. So yeah, I don't think that's far fetched at all.
Yeah, and I'd zoom out a bit actually, and say that we'll get into it in chapter 32 a lot more, especially the similarities or well, alignments, I suppose, with Mason and Dixon. Um, the in, what I'm thinking is essentially along the lines that a lot of Pynchon's novels are discussing kind of the enclosure of imagination in various different ways, and
Mhm.
what what we have in this California Sunshine bit is a peek into Maxine's formulation of these ideas as a New Yorker, and in the same way that the three-dimensional shadow of a hypercube is a cube.
Mm,
California is Maxine's shadow of this global enclosure of imagination and escape.
that's a really good point. Yeah, I like how you've described that. The conversation continues, and I really love this quote on 339 that starts with "They gaze at each other." Does anyone want to read that out?
They gazed at each other for a while down here on the barroom floor of history, feeling sucker punched. No clear way to get up and on with a day which is supposedly suddenly full of holes. Family, friends, friends of friends, phone numbers on the Rolodex just not there anymore. The bleak feeling some mornings that the country itself may not be there anymore, but being silently replaced screen by screen with something else, some surprise package, by those who've kept their wits about them and their clicking thumbs ready.
I love it. I love that quote. First of all, the feeling sucker punched down here on the barroom floor of history is just such a great just line. That's one of those lines you read it and you're like, man, I wish I was smart enough to come up with something like that. But then on top of it, that last part about the country itself may not be there anymore. That there is like a very real reality to that if you've lived in America pre and post 9/11. It feels like, and I've said this a couple times, that's like the end of history for this country. That whatever the American dream was, or whatever the '90s conception of the American dream was, that may still be alive in Portland but nowhere else, was completely killed by this arrival of the deep state becoming the controlling force of this country. That suddenly everything ran by the intelligence agencies, and we started a war that was going to have no end. And even though we're technically gone, we just have contractors over there now. We started the largest process of like the shock doctrine of capitalism over in the Middle East to try and get that to happen. We started watching everybody, controlling everybody. Whatever the American dream was prior to that, I feel like died at this point, and the country was replaced by something different, replaced by something sinister that had its hands tightly on the wheels of history to try and motivate it to only move when it wants it to.
Well, I was just going to ask. I hadn't thought about this until just now. But the replace screen by screen with something else, some surprise package by those who've kept their wits about them and their clicking thumbs ready. So just to clarify, I guess, do we think he's referring to a television remote control, or do you think there's some other image? Because these days, clicking thumbs, not the way you would phrase it, but that brings to mind like smartphones and stuff. And in 2013, Pynchon absolutely would have, been aware of smartphones. They were around. Do we think that was a reference just to the simple television remote control? Do you think that was a bit of breaking the fourth wall, or something else?
That's a good question. I interpreted this more from the standpoint of using a trackball mouse, because you would click with your thumb on one of those, and how so much of like the computer world uses those instead of a traditional mouse because of the control that it gives you over the cursor. And so, when you have these intelligence agencies that are hacking into networks or watching people or, navigating through the deep web or whatever, that's all being done on multiple computer screens and click by click rather than anything else. But it's possible that there's a different interpretation that could be applied there.
I definitely see it from. I can see that interpretation of it. I was seeing it more as the TV aspect of it, because I think this is also the time where the news went from being a source of literally news, which is what it was intended as, to this sort of not even opinionized journalism, but more of like presenting opinion as fact and using it as a method of pushing whatever agenda, be it on the right or the left.
Right.
And at the same time, the clicking thumb, this was also the same time where you started having a massive proliferation of channels and availability of different news outlets to watch, and you could watch multiple channels at the same time if you had the right TV. So it was all that idea of clicking from one news station to another to another to another, and just getting this massive influx of this is what you should feel, this is what you should think, this is what's happening. And it's no longer this idea of this event happened and that's all we're going to say on it. It became more of this happened and this is how you should feel about it. And you can go now, there's all these other channels that you can go to get those sort of ideas. At the same time, I do think there could be a little bit of fourth wall break at the same time, just Pynchon knowing what's down the road and being able to kind of insert that could very well be possible.
Well, and in line of what you mentioned, this is like the peak of the New York Post, right? In terms of how we think of the New York Post these days. This, like right around 9/11, was kind of the peak of its cultural relevance, and right around the time when everyone started to realize that, hey, there are these historically meaningful and respected institutions that have been co-opted and embraced as such by the people who agree with them. There was kind of a not a class consciousness, but almost like a news consumer consciousness forming around the way that media functioned right then, right there. I'm not sure, I wasn't around in the early 90s or anything to contrast it with, so I may be wrong, but it seems like in hindsight that's right around when that inflection point happened for most people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another reference in here that I really filled my head with another piece of literature when Sean here says, "Are we seeing some sort of wholesale return of the dead?" That really reminded me of the first section of The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot when I don't know if the words are taken exactly from there, but I feel like there's some sort of reference to that in The Wasteland when all of the dead like war veterans are crossing the London Bridge. This concept that like a nation has been broken by something and now all the dead are returning to somewhere else was immediately what that line reminded me of.
I mean, I think it's pretty well known that Pynchon has a fond appreciation of that particular book. So I would not be surprised if he included an intentional reference to it that way. I don't remember. I know the line or the section that you're talking about. I don't know if it is how word for word it is, but I know the section you're talking about.
Yeah. If I was at my place right now, I'd go pull my copy of it off the shelf.
I'm pulling it up. It's the first section.
Yeah, it's the last part of the first section. Is this interaction with one of the ghosts crossing the bridge?
Unreal City, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with the dead sound, the final stroke of 9. But not quite, but it's definitely thematically there.
Yeah, everyone go read The Wasteland if you haven't. That's very relevant
it's so
to it's very relevant to the nation of America post 9/11.
Yeah.
There's another, pretty much this whole section between Sean and Maxine is just it's just absolute perfection. But there's another line here starting with, do you remember that piece of footage on the local news on page 339 that runs to 340? Does somebody want to read that all the way to there's no uninnocent dead?
Do you remember that piece of footage on the local news just as the first tower comes down? Woman runs in off the street into a store, just gets the door closed behind her, and here comes this terrible black billowing ash debris sweeping through the streets, gale force past the window. That was the moment, Maxie. Not when everything changed, when everything was revealed. No grand Zen illumination, but a rush of blackness and death, showing us exactly what we've become, what we've been all the time. And what we've always been is living on borrowed time. Getting away cheap, never caring about who's paying for it, who's starving somewhere else, all jammed together so we can have cheap food, a house, a yard in the burbs. Planet-wide, more every day, the payback keeps gathering. And meantime, the only help we get from the media is boo-hoo the innocent dead. Boo fucking who. You know what? All the dead are innocent. There's no uninnocent dead.
I feel like that section really sums up what Pynchon has been writing his books to depict. Like,
yeah.
The creation of this evil empire of America through these different major segments of history, and just how 9/11 as whether you believe it was a conspiracy that was helped by the government or not, but as an event, showcased just what that evil empire had become. Because, and we'll talk about this when we get to the line Friedmanite hitman, but it is something that America was doing forever, where we would go into these places using the CIA or the FBI, and we would manipulate their government. We turn them over to the IMF. We talked about all of this as the book has gone on. But the destruction of those towers by a force of freedom fighters that we supplied with the weapons and training and know how to do that comes back over, destroys the towers, and then what do we do as a reaction of that? We level multiple countries in the Middle East and attempt to completely restructure their society in this Friedmanite shock doctrine way of doing business. And if anything has revealed the evils of the empire of America, it is the Patriot Act. It is everything that Promise was turned into as time went on, with the NSA programs, with everything that Snowden revealed, with the fact that we started building and expanding military bases all across the globe. We just kill random members of the Iranian government sometimes now, out of like a preemptive defense, and we've spent billions upon probably at least $1 trillion to exercise that bully pulpit across the world and in the process have not only sold our souls to those dark forces of capitalism, but destroyed our own populace in the process. Like, robbed people's ability to buy a house, robbed people's ability to pay for their medical bills if they get hurt, God forbid you slip and fall on a sidewalk in this country. All of that happened after this, and it is a revelation of what this country is and what it has always been behind the shadows, but just directly in the faces of not just its own citizenry, but the world. And to have that articulated so perfectly by someone that has been incredibly cynical this entire book in his approach to therapy is a really satisfying moment of just like, oh, yup, he's got it. He's got it exactly.
Well, and it's interesting. You mentioned that he's been so cynical in his approach to therapy, and I don't disagree. But the irony there is, and I think kind of the joke of the character is that while he's an incredibly cynical therapist, his overall view of the world has been almost naive, very optimistic at least. And it's awkward, at these points when Pynchon is clearly trying to put his own thoughts into the pages to try and differentiate between psychoanalyzing the character and psychoanalyzing the author, as all literary analysis is. I think he's being overly optimistic here in the sense that no, most people did not see that footage and come away from it with this understanding.
No, I don't think so.
This veil was not lifted for most people. I think for a lot of people it was, but I think for a lot of people it did the exact opposite, and that's one of those things that's is this Pynchon being hopeful? Is this Sean being lovably naive? Who knows?
I actually see it more so as Pynchon speaking through this character to the reader. Of if you've understood this book, if you've understood what I've been trying to write for my entire career, because again, I see this book as his final words, then you'll understand that what that video represents is this. I think it's more of a talking to Maxine as an insert for the audience moment.
Absolutely. I just mean specifically the framing of it as the veil coming down and people realizing this.
Yeah. Or potentially, it could be some reference to the idea that if you're capable of discovering that, then you'll know that, this video can represent that if you've done the work to figure it out. Any thoughts about the therapy session before we move on to the next scene? It's a lot in
it is
2 pages.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that it's Sean's dialogue here, and I think you can make this argument. I think for a lot of the characters in this book, I think that there are certain characters that Pynchon is using to insert his own voice in different situations to kind of explain his, and obviously we can't speak for him. This is all speculation, but it certainly has that feel. Sean's speech here, March Kelleher's, a lot of her dialogue comes across that way. A lot of the times where a character is kind of almost venting to the point of I've been trying to tell you this the whole time and no one's fucking listening. I don't know what else to do at this point. Those always feel very authorial self-insert. So yeah, Sean's conversation here is very much that for me.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that. And I don't remember who said it or what episode it was, but someone who was not me talked about the fact that, Pynchon has been through that cycle of the death of social movements and of these opportunities for change 4 times in his life.
Yeah.
And just how much that must wear on your soul as a person the longer that you live through it.
But I think with this also, especially with the mention earlier of what we were talking about with the way the news shifted from what it was to what it currently is. I think that's probably the final nail to him. In all of this is at that point now there's nothing we can do. And you can look at what Sean's talking about here, and this the way that people view that particular footage. And I very clearly remember that part of that footage.
It's terrifying.
It is, and if you consider the fact that we're at the point now where the media has taken something like that and can twist it around and can take these moments of terror and times in which we should be as a country, as almost as a world, should be coming together and understanding that we are all humans on this planet and we should really be working together to help each other out, they can take that and manipulate it in such a way that it turns us against ourselves.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating and frightening at the same time.
Yeah, there are a lot of good reasons that most of the time when I see people refer to, New York Times or the Washington Post as newspapers of record, they're putting quotes around it these days.
Yeah.
So after getting some sort of genuine Zen koans from her therapist, Maxine heads home, where Horst is at home, and is enjoying himself an evening of unaccustomed laughter, as it's put here. We get a reference here to. I really kind of wish that Pynchon hadn't clarified that he was talking about Mitch Hedberg,
Yeah.
and just left it as the description of a diffident comedian with long hair and amber sunglasses. Because that can't be anyone else. Like the only person that could be is Mitch Hedberg.
Yeah. Man, I miss that guy.
He's great.
He is a very that if so for anyone not familiar with Mitch Hedberg, I'm sorry, first of all. Please go find his albums. He may be one of the most Pynchonian comedians of the last 20 years.
I did see you put that in the notes here. Why did you say that? Out of curiosity.
Why he's a very Pynchonian comedian?
Yeah.
I don't think he ever wrote jokes for his audience. I think he was always trying to make himself laugh. And I don't think he cared at all if his jokes never landed. And you could hear it happen in a lot of his recordings where they just don't land, but he's laughing in his head because it's funny to him. And that's all he ever cared about. And eventually a lot of people will clock what he's doing. And it's Norm Macdonald did the same thing where his comedy was very much for him. And if you liked it, great. If you didn't, he didn't really care at all. If he could make himself and his friends laugh, that's all that mattered. And Mitch Hedberg, it's if you're not familiar with his work, it's a lot of one-liners, it's a lot of puns, and a lot of it is intentionally not dumb, but it's just intentionally lowbrow, but at the same time very highbrow because the wordplay he's using, it's insane. And I absolutely love him, and I miss him. I actually was supposed to see him when he died on tour. That was he died like 2 stops before I was going to go see him.
Damn. That is unfortunate.
It's interesting you mentioned Norm Macdonald because I would say that he's slightly more Pynchonian only because of his tendency towards Shaggy Dog stories.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. But the fucking moth story.
Yeah. Both of those
11 minutes to get to a punchline. It's so stupid.
But both of those comedians and Pynchon and many other great authors in comics, what they have almost done is like this, not systematizing and not like truly mathematizing of humor, but a willingness to like distill down what comedy is and then apply that to situations that are not humorous.
Yeah.
And doing so in such a strategic way that it is on a very high level, very stupid.
Yeah.
Very abstractly, very, very funny when you zoom out all the way, but also incredibly funny when you zoom in all the way. But in that middle ground where most humor operates, it just falls flat.
I think the best example I can think of what you're describing is actually Norm Macdonald's joke about shallow graves, where he talks about the absurdity of how many times they find a body in a shallow grave, and then he talks at length for like 20 minutes about how he would kill a woman if he was going to, all just for the punchline of a very deep grave at the very end of it. It's amazing.
I would say if it's not that, it's his appearance at the Bob Saget roast.
Oh, that was great too.
Absolute gold.
Yep. That was an insane appearance at a roast.
Just watching everyone in real time not understanding what was happening and why Norm Macdonald wasn't being funny. But everyone on stage was dying laughing.
Yeah. The fact that Norm Macdonald was able to get the largest laugh of one of his specials out of that shallow grave joke where he says, "And I do that thing that makes me feel like God," which is perhaps one of the darkest jokes that I think I've ever heard a comedian say. really speaks to his abilities in exactly the realm that Will is talking about when people can write at such a high level like that.
Yeah. I fucking miss that guy too.
Yeah, that was a hard one. So we get a mention of not just Mitch Hedberg, which the performance that Horst is watching, you can actually go watch. It is a reference to an actual performance of his on TV that I'm sure we can put in the show notes. But we then get a reference to him laughing at Keenan and Kel, which is a great reference for anyone who remembers that show.
Mhm.
What do we think about the fact that Horst is laughing a lot as opposed to previously? I have my own thought on it, but I wanted to open up the floor to see if anyone had any interpretations of this, because it's the whole scene. It's just Maxine remarking on how much he's laughing when normally he doesn't at all.
I think there's a few different ways you can take it. I mean, it could be a sign. You could even take it as a sign of mental instability. Although I think that would be perhaps definitely a reach.
Mm-hmm.
It could also, I mean, there are times in my life whenever I find things more funny than I do at other times. There are times when I find myself laughing hysterically at something like alone in a room. And I would watch it at other times and I wouldn't be laughing hysterically. So sometimes, things just kind of tickle people in different ways. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, it could be kind of a delayed response to surviving 9/11, where he's just kind of, like he says, I'm happy to be alive, where he's kind of laughing at the absurdity of how he kind of escaped death
Mm-hmm.
in some ways.
Yeah, I almost want to resort to my worst instincts and to say that it's in the book to be in the book,
Mm.
where it is a situation designed so that these questions are raised for the reader, because they're all every interpretation I can think of for this scene says something slightly different, but all gets at the same kind of point that Maxine herself concludes. And it's not a fun way to interpret it, but that's kind of the only way I can do so.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be taken from his explanation about how laughter is sacred and
Mhm.
cheapened by laugh tracks. I think to touch back on Luke's point, I think it is a very kind of personal thing, and it absolutely fluctuates over time, not just time but situationally as well. I think like Luke said, things that we find funny at one point might not register the same way later, or they might not be funny initially, and you come back around to it at some point. But I think that that specific mention of the trivialization by laugh tracks, we went through such a long stretch of television where we were basically being told what's funny. And I think the laugh track in a way also kind of shames people into not understanding what they're laughing at, which is a weird thing if you really think about how that could affect people mentally. I didn't really even start thinking about that until this sentence started coming out of my mouth. It's weird. Like, you're essentially, if you're not laughing along with it, you're clearly not in on the joke. And if you're not in on the joke, then you're on the outside. And if you're on the outside, then you're not part of what's going on. It's this whole weird thing. And I think, with laughter being such an intimate and personal thing, that can be very jarring for people. And so I think this is, Horst, again, a lot of emotions are out there and a lot of confusion after what happened on 9/11. And for a lot of people, comedy was a refuge and a place to feel normal again. But there was also a lot of uncertainty about whether it was okay to be laughing given the gravity of everything that had happened. So I don't know. There are a myriad of ways you could come at this. I don't necessarily think any of them would be wrong.
Yeah, for me, the read that I get from this is that, again, it's another instance of like watching someone retreat into that like return to being a bit more infantile, or return to being, I'm going to like close myself off with purchases, because he does end up buying a top of the line Roomba later on. Like,
Mhm.
I think it's mainly there for Max, in my interpretation. I think that all of the stuff that we talked about goes into it, certainly, but sort of giving the reader through Maxine's relationship with Horst a through line of watching one of these people sort of go through that process of just like, I don't want to think about it. I'm just gonna like watch stuff that'll make me laugh, and I'm just gonna like buy stuff because that'll like maybe help fill the void inside me, and just sort of descending into that overall feeling. I feel like is sort of what this kind of is depicting. At least that's what I came away with it with.
Yeah, and on a more character note, like Horst is, it has been a month. There's the whole joke of happy to be alive thing, but Horst is not the kind of person who's gonna cry over this trauma that has almost physically happened to him and has actually happened to him in the meaningful sense. He is sitting there laughing his ass off because it's catharsis in that very classical sense. It's the crying, it's laughing, it's whatever it is, it's emotion being expressed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most certainly. Although laughing your head off at Keenan and Kel might be a bit of a stretch.
Not if you're like 10 years old at the time.
Yeah.
I used to really love Keenan and Kel growing up.
It still
It-
holds up.
it's
I introduced it to my kids.
Funny, but it's not losing your mind funny.
Not, yeah. Now,
Yeah.
Mitch Hedberg, I will still laugh my ass
Yeah.
off.
One to kind of tie together the Mitch Hedberg-ness with the kind of more symbolic stuff about retreating into your less developed self. An aspect of Mitch Hedberg comedy that's very very obvious is that it's all one-liners. It's all very short. It's all very succinct. There's not time to reflect because, and that's why like a lot of his jokes not worked for him as a performer is because he would deliver a joke within 4 seconds and be on to another one instantly. So you have a lot of that same symbolic resonance with the news media, where the news is having you freaking out over whatever is important at the moment, and then by the time the next thing happens, you haven't had time to situate that horrible thing within your own story or whatever, however you want to think about it. And Mitch Hedberg is kind of working on the same level, although in a much more pleasant and less sinister way.
It's like TikTok reels, but jokes.
Yeah.
Just immediately move to the next one. In the next scene, Maxine is headed into the office, and she runs into Justin. We get a good reference to the Patriot Act coming out of the works and legalizing everything. And they sit together to talk for a little bit, and they bring up the Global Consciousness Project. Since you did so much research on it, Cody, do you want to talk about? I brought it up, I think, in the very first episode, but
I think we mentioned it a while back.
yeah. Do you want to talk about the GCP?
I'll talk on it briefly because there's a lot to get into, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. Basically, it started in 1998. And the general concept, which we talked about earlier, was to kind of see if there was this unification of collective thought around the world and how that could be measured and analyzed. It is universally rejected by scientists. Basically, the main complaint or the main argument against it is that the way they select their data is inconsistent, and there's a lot of pattern matching and selection bias. So they're basically very carefully selecting the information that they want to analyze, and which a lot of pseudoscience operates on that same plane, where it's pick out the parts that work to support your theory, and then you only highlight those parts and push away everything else that refutes it, which is most of it. The exception to this came actually with their 9/11 analysis. So this kind of ties into that random numbers thing suddenly becoming non-random. And I found a review of that particular analysis that I'll post in the show notes. But basically, what they found was that yes, they were able to kind of show a sort of heavy quotes proof of a collective unification of thought or a non-randomness that occurred within the time frame that 9/11 happened, like just before the first attack. However, what this review found was that if you pull back, I think the time window was like a half hour. It completely destroys all of that data. So they basically got lucky in the window of time that they chose to highlight and to focus on. But if you adjust the parameters of that even a little bit, the whole thing falls apart and has absolutely no bearing whatsoever. So I think it's an interesting thing. And I was actually talking to my wife about this the other day. These kind of things that I hesitate to call it mysticism, but there is a sort of mystical element to it, and a lot of it exists in this sort of Penchant universe. Makes for great narrative, but it is not meant to carry over into the real world. It operates, I think, in these books as a sort of way of explaining the unexplainable, but it doesn't stand up to actual science. So always be careful about what you're buying into, and make sure that you're verifying information.
Yeah, and I mean, it's much like all the stuff with like Project Artichoke or Monarch or the Montauk Project. Like a lot of that stuff is in Bleeding Edge in particular. It's sort of like an outgrowth of these institutions of government or the WASP apparatus and the things that they inevitably just sort of like get into. Obviously this GCP was founded and run at Princeton, which if there's going to be, any particular concentration of wealth and waspy types, Princeton is going to be up there as far as as far as a place for that to exist in. But Princeton is also an interesting place historically for shit like this, because they used to have the Engineering Anomalies Research Lab in Princeton, where in 1979, the Dean of Engineering, Robert G. Yan, started the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, and they studied like psychokinesis and remote viewing and like all of these weird aspects of parapsychology that it already by the 70s you didn't need to invest money in. Almost the 80s. Like they were messing around with this stuff, 11 or 12 years before the founders of the Global Consciousness Project was starting to get involved in putting their project together. Like Princeton just kind of has a weird history with stuff like that. There's no like super conspiracy angle to run down with that Engineering Anomaly Research Lab as far as I know, but it's just one of those weird things where this is very real history of just Princeton as an outgrowth of its position in the world, looking into strange shit like this.
Mm-hmm.
We also learned that Deep Archer is someone has infiltrated it, and that they seem to be locked inside. That seems to be listed there as potentially a usage for why the random number generators stopped being random, so that those government forces could finally steal what they've been trying to steal for most of the book. But beyond that, I don't see too much else to talk about within these sections.
Yeah.
So then, eventually, she heads home, and Horst is cooking some French food, and then she is assaulted by a Roomba. So we learned that he's been shopping, and he's bought this Roomba. I like this quote here. Actually, won't be released till fall. Got this one at the early adopters preview sale. Wave of the future, honey bunch. Irony free. Unthinkable a year or two ago. Meantime, it's Maxine's turn now to have these undomestic urges, which for those to whom balanced books appeal seems fair. Guilt? What's that? It's yeah.
I was going to say that I didn't. This made me realize that Roombas were as old as they were.
Yeah, they've been around a while.
They have, but what he's talking about, he essentially got one before they actually came out, because they actually came out in September 2002. Mm-hmm. So he had he was beta testing a Roomba basically.
He got it at the early adopters preview.
Yeah.
But that gets back to the point that I had previously made about he's headed down this sort of retreating to consumerism or inner sort of denial about stuff that's going on. He's buying technology that's untested, unproven, just because it's the newest fun thing. And
retail therapy.
Yeah, exactly. And is becoming such a different person that Maxine is maybe I want him out of my house.
Starting to think about this again.
Maybe it was not a great idea to hook back up with my abusive ex-husband. Which, you know what? I agree, Maxine. Get him out of there.
Well, I wonder if this is absolutely conspiracy corner tier of thinking. But it's a very small conspiracy. It's really just a Pynchon conspiracy. Basically, the Roomba came out in 2002, and this book came out in 2013. And in the beginning, Roombas, basically, my understanding of their artificial intelligence was non-existent. They would go in a straight line, and if their bumpers hit something, they would turn in some whatever probabilistically generated angle to avoid hitting it again, whatever the object was. And by the time this book came out, Roombas had become like a somewhat intelligent. They were beginning to actually do A, lidar mapping, and B, like learning, quote unquote, the floor plan of the house. And I wonder if that isn't some kind of point trying to kind of drive home the kind of distillation of all the discussion of technological advancement and the random number generation as a, stopping as a result of 9/11 or vice versa, however you want to frame it.
That's interesting.
It is.
I'm more horrified by the idea of a Roomba mapping out my house.
Yeah.
While I
Radar
sleep.
mapping your house.
Yeah, I mean,
There's-
I don't think there's any reason to believe that any of it's being collected, but
No,
yeah,
it's just
it is
still a very
concerning.
disconcerting thing to think about.
Yeah,
Especially given that it's a shitty vacuum. Like, it doesn't
really
even...
is.
You
It
still...
really is.
In the instructions for them, it still says that you have to do regular vacuuming because it can't, like, properly vacuum the floor. Why anyone has ever bought a Roomba is so far beyond me. I don't understand.
Yeah, I really. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you have any theories as to why why Eric Outfield thinks spritzing his clothes with a 27-ounce bottle of Febreze is akin to washing them?
Well, have you seen the commercials? They prove that Febreze captures and eliminates the odor.
Yeah.
Why waste all the water?
Don't
Okay.
shame him for doing college laundry.
So you're saying he's being an environmentalist, is what you're actually...
Yes. Yeah, he's saving energy. We should all aspire to be like Eric Outfield.
We should all aspire to be like Eric Outfield.
If
Weird.
we've learned one thing throughout this book.
Eric is the real hero here.
That's the takeaway from Bleeding Edge. Be like Eric Outfield.
Yeah, saving the planet, one 27-ounce bottle of Febreze at a time.
It turns out, speaking of pointing accusations, that Eric and Driscoll are still dating, as much as you can call that dating, despite the fact that they're living by an 11 p.m. curfew. We also have found out that Eric has got quite a hard-on for justice now, in trying to go after hash slingers. And we get another reference to WTF being there. And in this sort of back and forth, we learn that Eric is going to try and find some way to either, DDoS attack hash slingers or do something to kind of get back at them. And we kind of learn that there's, like, Eric is a very capable guy. He's got plans and all of that, but Maxine kind of tells him that you're not going to be able to do anything to him. Like they're far too insulated. They're far too powerful. And then Eric brings up a theory that the WTF is funded by the CIA, which would make perfect sense given everything that Maxine has encountered in the book so far. And even when she hears that, it kind of connects a lot of dots in her head where you kind of hear the Kill Bill sirens going off as he says that. And so, any thoughts on this sort of back and forth conversation between the two of them about the CIA and WTF and the fact that Eric suddenly wants to really do something instead of just snooping around?
I think it's an interesting parallel with Eric and who was it at the end of chapter 30 that Irv was talking about, that was essentially a mall cop that thought he was all of a sudden the big first responder guy. God, why can't I think of his name? That Heidi was dating.
Carmine?
Carmine, thank you. It's that kind of post 9/11 thing of that shift in there's a responsibility to kind of I don't know, like go above and beyond what you would normally do to right the wrong. Like I think there was a lot of people that had that kind of mindset and existed more, I think, in within the law enforcement community, but also I guess you could really extend that out to someone like Eric who, in the wake of all of this and seeing the scale of what's happened, kind of wanting to step up and do more and have this kind of internal feeling of like, I need to do something to stop someone, like whether or not you can actually pin down who that someone is, or whether it's even within your grasp, is with Eric's situation here that Maxine has to kind of like back him down and be like, you're fishing in too big of a pond here, and the effort is appreciated, but there's really nothing that you're going to be able to do to single-handedly stop this. There's really nothing that anyone or any collective of people at this point can do anymore.
Yeah, especially if the CIA was behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, as talented as you might be, Eric, you're gonna take on the CIA? Really? That's your plan? But I do like the choice to construct this whole investigation around the Wahhabi trans-religious friendship. Where, in a book from an author, this book in particular, it's so full of discussion of conspiracy theories and discussion of like these correlative events that may be causative, and someone who has spent so much of his career lampooning, but also kind of signifying more subtly sympathy with conspiracy theories and all of these things. It is fun to have a narrative where it actually makes the most sense for the CIA to be involved. Where like, yeah, no, there previously this is just like a weirdo like cash moving scheme for some inconceivable reason. But if the CIA is doing this to pay dissident groups or whatever, or spies or whoever in particular, that makes way more sense than pretty much any other explanation.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also probably true. Like they were certainly paying some people in the Middle East during this period, because as I talked about several episodes ago, when the CIA obtained the passport and travel visas of the main guy who planned 9/11 at the the airport. You're not going to do that without greasing the palms of some of the people over there in Dubai. Did anyone have an explanation of this Moloch exploit that he describes?
I read what was on the Pynchon wiki and I could not make sense of it, so I got nothing.
You can do it, Will.
Well, so I can explain it, but I think he's just screwing with the guy. Because so malloc is used, it literally is the function that you use in a lot of programming languages, mostly C, where it's mostly going to be discussed, to like carve out part of RAM for program usage on the fly. And it's just a source of a lot of bugs, and it's very hard to pin them down when they're happening when the source is malloc, because it is so integral to the system, and so debugging any particular misbehavior with that as the source of the problem is very difficult to do. And when you're actually going about fixing it, it's even trickier, because it might be working properly in every other way, but if you tweak it so that this one bug doesn't happen anymore, you might cause other bugs because things are relying on behavior that shouldn't happen. I really do think it's just like, this is a good throw in for the tech guys, because this is the kind of thing that you would do if you were a hacker trying to screw with somebody, is you would screw with their malloc lib.
Okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense.
It's also I think it's a pun on the end of history kind of stuff too, because it's memory allocation.
That would make sense. All right, so then we get a brief sort of reminiscence on their time after Joie de Vivre. I don't know what to make of that, of the end of the chapter.
Yeah, it's a weird,
sort of weird, warm look back at the time that he got a foot job for Maxine.
Yeah, I don't have anything really.
Nope. Don't know what the appeal of that is for Maxine, but I'm glad she's happy.
Well, from Eric's perspective, I think it comes down to that renewed sense of justice that he has in the
Mm.
face of 9/11. And for Maxine, I think it's just the extension of, her less than domestic instincts at the moment.
Sure.
She,
That's fair, yeah.
I've always felt like she had a slightly less unpleasant time with it than everyone else seems to have interpreted that experience with Eric.
Well, it seems like she's completely into it when it's happening.
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
think she remarks on that actually.
yeah. I don't think she had a bad time. I had a bad time reading it.
Yeah,
It was-
same.
that's what it was.
Sure. So yeah, I think that for her, it was a fun moment because it was a new experience at the very least, even if she doesn't actually enjoy it. And so this
Yeah.
is just, idle, subconscious, like, well,
It's always there, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's an example of her missing being single.
That could be. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. So 32 opens up with a call from Greg Despard, who's moved out to the Pacific Northwest. And we learn that he's temping at Microsoft. I do love Maxine's characterization of the Pacific Northwest, where she says, "Greg, you're out there in Riot Girl country with those wholesome evergreen trees and charcoal briquettes pretending to be coffee and whatever, right? Please release yourself." Just as a one sentence description, really love that. And then yeah, he makes a reference to the fact that the hardest part of working at Microsoft is getting used to the Stormtrooper gear. That's that's a joke about Microsoft being referred to as the evil empire by a lot of tech people. And we just get sort of a nice like update on his life, or the life he's trying to build before it switches and they start talking about the video that they shot. Um, and how, just still very nervous about the entire thing he is, even though he seems to have really escaped. We also learn that he sent out not just the video to Maxine, but to a bunch of people, hoping that somebody would pick it up. And in this case, March was able to. And then we get this nice little line about how someday there will be a Napster for videos.
Yep.
That was only 4 years away. YouTube premiered in 2005. I didn't know this. It was bought by Google in 2006.
Was
Only
it that
ye-
quick?
Yeah,
Mhm.
only a year after they came out. I for some reason like living through that as it happened, I feel like I only became aware that YouTube was bought by Google until like years afterwards.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
I would have pinned it at like 2010 at the earliest.
Yeah, that was what my memory was telling me. But yeah, it was almost immediately afterwards that Google was like, "Well, that's ours now."
Wild.
That's
Oh,
going to
well,
be
what
worth a
isn't
lot of
theirs?
money.
Well, so there's actually, I think there's actually a lot going on the technical level for that. Nowhere
Mhm.
near as in depth as the Malak stuff, but like basically, there's the line. There's always a way to monetize anything. YouTube, up until like very recently, like the last 5 years, I think, was running in the red consistently, no matter
Oh, did
how
they
many
finally turn a
ads.
profit?
I think so. I'm not sure. Google changed their corporate structure sometime in the last 10 years, so it's a little less transparent. But basically, the the assumed knowledge is that for like the first 10 to 15 years of YouTube's existence, it was running in the red as a loss leader because, well, you get to maintain market dominance by providing free limitless video uploads. And the only reason that a company could ever offer free unlimited video uploads at any decent quality is if they are playing a long con with venture capital or similar funding structure. There is no way that you can make money by selling, a reasonable amount of ads and store that much video data on demand for everyone. Like that, it's an insane amount of data that YouTube holds.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure that they run in the black today. I mean, sure,
No,
someone
it-
knows, but
It doesn't look like I'm looking at Alphabet's annual report that they published 9 months ago. And it looks like all that they're willing to say is that YouTube is worth about 10% of Alphabet's revenue, which is about $29 billion. So that's the revenue that YouTube is able to get for Alphabet year over year. But there's no way that that's a profit at all. Because like you're saying, well, like the amount of money it would take to store an ever expanding video library has to be one of the most expensive things you could possibly do.
Yeah, and it would be one thing if it was like cold storage, if people were uploading videos for archival purposes and then you sent
Right.
a request to watch a video. But no,
Yep.
to have all of that on, spinning disks or solid state drives 24/7 accessible to the entire world in 4K these days, 4K 60 FPS. Like that's not financially possible without charging people a lot of money every month at least.
I mean, that's really the problem that all social media has. Like whether it's Instagram, X, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. It's all the fact that it's not you're storing so much data forever, and it's not actually like turning any kind of easy profit because you're not going to be able to make up for the even just the data storage costs off of advertising. That's why it's all just trying to turn into watch time or like use time now instead of actually trying to be a genuine product or service.
Yeah, and it would be one thing if Twitter had stayed just, 140 characters you link to an image or a video. But no, I mean, when you're storing imagery, it is practically impossible to do that economically with advertising even.
Yeah.
Television relies on so many grandfathered in technologies to function, and people spend so much money on, cable or satellite connection every month. And those are going directly to the people who are paying for the channels, the producers of the content. How does that work when there's 5,000 times as much content and there isn't this pre-established physical infrastructure maintaining all of it? You have to run the videos across the world every time someone wants to watch it.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing that was created, especially given that it wasn't created by Google or one of these massive companies, but just some people.
Well, and that's why it's not, for the sake of the book, and the sake of the analogy. Yes, YouTube is the Napster for video, but it's not. The reason it's not is that Napster was peer-to-peer. All the files
Yeah.
you were looking at were on someone else's computer who had the Napster program running in the background, and they were paying for dial-up. YouTube is one repository that is accessible 24/7. That's a fundamentally different structure, and it's people talk about, oh, peer-to-peer is not reliable, and the reason it's not reliable is because someone's not getting paid to run it.
Does anyone have any idea what she's asking about shorting Microsoft about? I was curious if that had something to do with like the history of the time or anything like that, but I couldn't find anything specifically that pointed to why you'd be wondering if you should be shorting Microsoft in 2001.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything either. My only thought with that was just given the information that she learned from Horst about the short sales just before 9/11. Maybe she's wondering like, do I need to know about something that might happen? The next thing that might come up. Some kind of widespread, computer attack or something like that.
I think that between the discussion of shorting all the investment firms and Citigroup and stuff in the previous chapters, I think it might also be kind of a joke about famously Martha Stewart's insider trading.
Oh yeah,
The Imclone stock trading case, which happened at the end of 2001 and then was prosecuted a few years later. That's all I can get out of it, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. Man, every time I remember that Martha Stewart went to jail for insider trading, it's very strange.
It's wild. It's really weird. What a world we live in.
And now she's most famous for cooking with Snoop Dogg on television.
Well, she's found her niche.
Good for her. After that, Maxine and Cornelia decide that they're going to do lunch, but beforehand, she goes down to Streetlight People and gives a report on hash slingers that she got from Windust to good old Rocky Slagiat. And it turns out that they're going to take their money out of it anyway. And the reason why is that the company's turned into an inside corp. If you remember back to the episode where I talked extensively about Promise and some of the inside corps that existed there, this is sometimes what happens to companies. They get so invested in government contracting that they don't need any venture funds anymore. They don't need any money at all anymore. They're tied to the federal government that's just going to keep supporting them, and that is what has happened to Hashslingers. And so, regardless of this report that Maxine brings him, it was what they were going to do anyway because there was no money left in it. And so they decide to close out Maxine's time working with the company. So I'm off the case, but on my Rolodex forever. Spare her, Cornelia Breesigan. He's always telling me the same thing. Don't listen. Get out of here, you ditzy broads. I got work to do. He's just such a ridiculous.
He really is. Must have been a lot of fun to write him.
I'm sure every Italian stereotype, I think Pynchon probably has a really fun time writing. I could you imagine how fun it would be to write those ex-mob guys in Vineland?
Yeah, I was about to say.
But this sort of represents another sort of closing out of one story thread that has run through the book. You know, that this aspect of it is done. We get one less update from Reg. That part of it is done. Like he's starting to get towards the end of his book. He's closing out these storylines, but not before Maxine and Cornelia head out to. I love this quote. Owing to Cornelia's impression that Maxine somehow observes kosher eating guideline, they end up at another Jewish deli. Mrs. Pickness's Chicken Soup Emporium, a chain yet. Everybody seems to be from out of town. Fortunately, the appetites Maxine and Cornelia have brought with them are more for schmoozing than authenticity challenged gefilte fish. I love that line. You know, and I think it's really important that this is the same kind of establishment as the one that they go to after they go shopping earlier in the book. Mm-hmm. It's this place that's like kind of yuppie, claims to be one of these like authentic places, but in actuality it was built as a replacement for what was something that was probably authentic in the neighborhood beforehand, and that the only people in there are not locals. They're just out-of-towners who heard that this is the place to go.
Yep.
And that is backed up by the fact that the gefilte fish they have is less than authentic, which as a Jewish person, it's probably better that it's less than authentic. I'm sure they found some way to make that food actually palatable.
I love the idea that anybody hears the name Mrs. Pincus's Chicken Soup Emporium and thinks, this is an authentic New York Jewish deli.
This is a real experience here.
Chicken Soup Emporium.
Yeah, so it's nice to have like a consistent through line of just like, yeah, they keep going to these like gentrification spots, and it's out of this weird like obsession that Cornelia has with Jewish culture and like delis, and it's very like, because they're from California, right? Slagiot and his wife, yeah. So it's certainly like one of these things where you come in from out of town and you're like very invested in the local colors, so to speak. It's very telling that for Cornelia, that is just Jewish people. That's what she sees as sort of the local culture of New York, which I guess that is kind of a pervasive thing that people hear about New York, is the like heavily Jewish population, mostly in Brooklyn. But they start talking about how one of her family members works for the CIA. But seemingly only because he loves snitching on people?
Yeah.
Like how
Yes.
how he's ended up with a job for the corporation is so funny to me.
I love that she keeps referring to him as an idiot, but then works that into why he is so qualified to work for the CIA.
Yeah. Do you want to read that quote?
Idiots, basically. Mm-hmm. Don't mistake my meaning. Cousin Lloyd was always an agreeable child. He and I got along well at family gatherings. None of the food he threw would actually ever strike me personally. But beyond mealtime assault, his true gift, one might say compulsion, was for tattling. He was always creeping about, observing the less supervised activities of his peers, taking detailed notes, and when these weren't convincing enough, I'm embarrassed to say, making things up. So, perfect CIA material. Ever so long on their wait list till last year a position in the Inspector General's office fell vacant. Cousin Lloyd is a real piece of work.
He is. He strikes me as another character who, if you sent him to the Middle East, he also would get tahini all over his shirt in the course of having a conversation with you.
Yeah.
Maxine decides that she's going to try and use him to gain some more information about what the CIA's involvement might have been. after her couple of conversations she's had, but also kind of to like alert Windust that there might be people snooping around or that she's still snooping around. And so she agrees to try and kind of get him connected with Cousin Lloyd. And I love that line where she goes, "Shall I ask him to get in touch?" And then she says, "Thanks, Cornelia. I owe you one." Or, without having met Lloyd yet, say at least half of one. That's an expression that I'm gonna have to like find an excuse to use at some point. I
Yeah,
think.
for sure.
I also love the description of Cousin Lloyd, because you can tell that he's been trying to moonlight for so long, but no one has actually asked for his help. And so his appearance starts with it says, "Cousin Lloyd, luckily not into the NYC dating scene where haste like this would earn him instant rejection." Calls Maxine early the next day. He sounds so nervous that Maxine decides to lull him with generic accounting fraud talk. Just like an absolute moron.
But he's so excited. He gets to. Someone wants to hear him talk now.
I was not laughing this hard when I was reading this section, but going back through it, he's
like an eager puppy just
character.
knocking everything off of tables because someone's here to pet him.
Exactly.
Well, it's really reminiscent of just to distract from your crying laughter. It's really reminiscent of the earlier mention of from what's his name, Maxine's father, saying everyone always says that the problem with conspiracy theories is that it's so hard to get everyone to stay quiet.
Mhm.
But no, these are the people who are raised from birth to keep secrets. And I mean, it's not just keep secrets, it's also this kind of like people pleasing instinct
Yep.
that Cousin
Yeah.
Lloyd's exhibiting.
Oh my God, you're
Absolutely.
so right. Especially to the degree that he's like, "Oh yeah, well I have security clearance up to eyes only, so I can do whatever you want." Like, it's such people pleasing behavior.
Well, yeah, saying that gets your security clearance revoked from as far as
Oh,
I
yeah.
understand.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
sure.
As someone who was going to go into the military and so had to put herself and her family through a security clearance like process, it's you're really putting a lot on the line just by saying that out loud.
Yeah.
He in this is where we get this line from Maxine where it says, "Once again, whoever's listening, I am not numbered among Mr. Windust's fan base and know next to nothing about him, except he's some kind of Friedmanite hitman, working 24/7 to keep the world convenient for people perhaps much like yourself, Mr. Thrubwell." And this is another case where like it's just one word, but you can really take
It's a
it
loaded
quite
word.
far. Yeah, absolutely. For those who don't know, the term Friedmanite is a reference to Milton Friedman. This is a guy who served as Reagan's economic advisor during his presidency, but he's most famous prior to that for creating what is known as the Chicago School of Economics. Once again, looking at like the Midwestern economic sort of history through this book. This was sort of a loosely defined term for the work of several, but not all, of the professors in the economics school at the University of Chicago. Eventually, that department actually began receiving funding from the CIA. And that kind of was what set up Milton Friedman's path to power, so to speak, of getting hooked up with Reagan and of providing a bit more of a, I'll say in inverted commas, service to the country. It's a very interesting history that you can go down. There's a lot of books about it, especially like why the government would be involved in it. But during the 1973 coup in Chile, a group of Chilean nationals were involved, and they became known as the Chicago Boys. That's because they were sent to be trained at the University of Chicago and were personally sort of mentored by Friedman in like free market economics and how you can kind of convert your country to that. And so when we talk about stuff like we did earlier in the book with the Dirty War and with the School of the Americas and these different sort of policies that were put out, through Washington and through NGOs, that were still clearly affiliated with the government. This is another outgrowth of that. This Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman's involvement in it, and sort of the different like training that he helped pass on to people down in South America during that period. It was all wrapped up in this idea of like not just killing leftist movements across the board, but also opening up these countries to free market capitalism, which gives control to the Western powers, to the IMF, to all of the things that they can then sort of intervene in there going forward. There's an excellent, Will?
I was just going to say, in the service of continuing my important value of this podcast of translating to not less indoctrinated conservatives, Milton Friedman is the guy who gave the investment banker in the previous chapters the thing to complain about.
An excellent point.
That is what Milton Friedman brought to economics as a discipline, is that idea.
Yeah, very true. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of Milton Friedman and all of the work of his time with Reagan and the Dirty War and all that, Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, as I've referenced a couple times in this book, is really a great place to go. She breaks down not just sort of that whole time frame, but the idea of capitalism and free market economics being used as like a occupying force in countries to get them to change their way of life. She talks a lot about South America and Reagan and Friedman during that book. She also talks extensively about how Iraq and Afghanistan were like our most concentrated effort at the shock doctrine, as she sort of coins it. Really, really good book. Naomi Klein's also just a really good writer in general. She's written a lot of books that are all very, very interesting and worth your time.
Yeah, definitely is.
And so, the stooge himself, Cousin Lloyd, says that he's gonna take a look into it. And there's this closing quote in this chapter that I really like, where it says, "At least if Lloyd's cousin Cornelia thinks he is, Windows should become aware of CIA interests in a fairly short time. No reason he shouldn't start watching his back like everybody else. Right now, petty molestation is about all that's available to Maxine down here in the small time, without anything you can call a moral sightline. No way to know how to compete at that elite level. That planetary pyramid scheme Windust's employers have always bet everything on, with its smoothly delivered myths of the limitless. No idea of how to step outside her own history of safe choices and douse her way across the desert of this precarious hour, hoping to find what? Some refuge? Some American deep archer?" I just like that quote because it's not just a depiction of the fact that she's still caring enough about Windust to warn him that someone might be coming after him at some point, but also this depiction of like even a character who is well adjusted enough to not retreat into like Horst is, or like these people that she sees on the street are. She is still herself wondering if she's not just looking for some kind of refuge at some point, or some place other than this, because of how unrecognizable the country has become. And the closest thing that she can think of in her head to associate that with is Deep Archer, that online space that she was in so long ago. And that to her seems like the most likely refuge that one could find, which is, of course, a different outgrowth of the same problem that everyone else is having. She's just as pulled towards finding refuge in technology or social media or games or entertainment as everybody else.
Yeah, and I especially love that paragraph because, I mean, I'm going to say the last two sentences of it, I guess, are in a very skewed, very much in the character of Maxine's viewing, kind of getting at the, if there is a thesis, the political thesis of Mason and Dixon. And that's just really satisfying to come across, especially with the punning of American Deep Archer.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. American Departure. Really, really great stuff. Anything else that anyone has from chapter 32?
I do think I just real quickly want to highlight what I thought was a nice little touch of character development on Maxine's end. At the very beginning of the chapter, when we find out that Reg is in over in Seattle or in the Pacific Northwest, at least, that he's Maxine refers to it as Riot Girl country.
Mm-hmm.
I think that speaks in a weird way a lot about her, because I think the easier route to go with referencing that scene would have been the grunge movement, which is very male centric, but for Maxine to recognize it as the Riot Girl epicenter, I think speaks a lot to her past and her continued growth. Just that she would be more focused on the feminine side of the punk movement and everything that came out of there, rather than the grunge side of it, the more popular and more well known part of it.
Yeah, no, I agree completely.
Riot Girl's awesome. Go listen to Riot Girl.
It's really
fucking
good.
awesome.
Really good. Really
Kathleen
good stuff.
Hanna just wrote a biography. I need to read it. My wife read it and said it was really good.
It does not surprise me that Kathleen Hanna can also write a very good book. She's an excellent artist. Chapter 33 starts with Maxine being in the deep web again and sort of navigating around, and suddenly a lot of things have changed. There's a lot of new people. There's a lot of new people there. There's a lot of new infrastructure there. A bunch of stores have popped up that weren't there prior. And this was the section that sent me into like a 4-page frenzy of note taking. Where in the first paragraph, the last sentence of the first paragraph says, she wonders if, sure enough, here they are lurking around the entrance to a Starbucks. A pair of cyber flaneurs who turn out to be Eric's ad business acquaintances, Promo Man and Sandwich Girl. It's the usage of the word cyber flaneurs that like sent me into this like tizzy that I got into, because it's the second such usage of the term in this book. Not cyber flaneur specifically, but the word flaneur. The first being used to refer to I don't remember the character's name, the ex-IDF Mossad guy who was just sort of on the street pretending that he was a flaneur, and sort of Maxine remarks that that's not something that you can do anymore, that capitalism has just killed your ability to kind of be just sort of a man about town, so to speak. That to exist in the world now, it requires a buy-in to some larger consumer ethos of living. Kind of like a tweet that I saw once that said, why can't I leave the house without spending $40? It's because you're not supposed to anymore. There's no opportunities for you to just sort of exist in real space anymore. And so the internet was like this new frontier to exist in. It was supposed to represent, as we've talked about a lot in this season of our show, where things could and should have been done differently. You could buy stuff on the internet if you want, but certainly 2001 was prior to the real sort of hyper mobilization of that aspect of internet. Bleeding Edge takes place when that facade is like just about to start to crumble. Like the opportunity for the internet to be something different is about to fall apart, but excuse me, the hammer hasn't like completely come down yet. And the deep web is sort of in a state just prior to the same invasion that the regular internet went through. We talked about the eternal September, when suddenly like computers and internet hookups became very democratized. And so now the deep web is experiencing somewhat of a similar aspect, and Maxine is watching it through her couple of different trips to the deep web over the course of the story, and how this is already changing. The writing for the deep web and the surface web is certainly on the wall, but we just haven't gotten to that. But it's still innocent enough for there to be these genuine flaneurs still wandering around. Like they're there, they can still kind of exist without engaging in any of this like capitalist behavior. They can just sort of idly click around the internet. Cyber flaneurs was a term that was put forward in this New York Times piece that you can go read about people who just literally idly click around on the internet, just like looking at random stuff. You can't really do that anymore. They even have taken that away from us. It's always you have to be engaged with something, or you have to be signing up for something, or you have to be watching something. That sort of era of idle web surfing is gone, and these characters are standing in front of a Starbucks in the deep web. And if there is ever a company that is a specter of capitalism coming to ruin third places, it's fucking Starbucks. Like Starbucks is a company that has tried to exist with this third place mentality from the very beginning, and as time has gone on, it has turned into just a fast food company as opposed to, a genuine third place where you can go and sit and just exist without having to buy things. You can stay there as long as you want. And so it's just this really interesting tableau that she's watching this kind of eternal September unfold in all aspects of life when it comes to the internet. Now that kind of the real world after 9/11 has been decimated for anyone to enjoy. And so extrapolating from there with what kind of Will is talking about with Mason and Dixon, like Bleeding Edge represents sort of this like final phase and a reset to all of Pynchon's canon, when read chronologically. Like I had mentioned with the video and the way that Sean talks about it, revealing kind of what his writing has been about and what America is. That's sort of what this is as well. Throughout Mason and Dixon, but particularly towards the end, Pynchon analyzes the concept of the arrival of the world as like a death of paradise or a death of the possibility of Eden, and that like these small, closely knit tribes of people are able to live in harmony with one another in the land. But once modernizing forces come in, it breaks all of that apart. And as a result of that, it invites that evil of the modern world, of modern technology, to come in and continue to sort of despoil things. And so when you go back to the parable of the old woman, that tells that exact thing. She's talking about how that process happens. You have a ruler, and eventually they have secret appetites, secret desires, and then as soon as they start to engage in that, they need to pay people off. They need to expand these big intelligence industries. They need to expand what they control and what they want to do, and it just builds and builds and builds from there. These things have to be managed, and as long as they are managed and as long as they grow, so too does the evil in the world, and so too does the sort of rule of law. In that way, it's almost like Pynchon is saying there's no good amount of modernity. Like all of it leads to what we're dealing with to a certain extent or another, and that the people who are trapped in America, so to speak, are the inheritors of a great deal of evil. And then when you go back to Vineland, as we talked about at the end of Vineland, he makes that quote about how there is this great weight of evil pushing down on the scale from one side, and it requires certain people with small actions to push it back to being somewhat at equilibrium. And he's pointing out that that still is the case here, but they're still going to find a way to come in. It's not something you can ever give up on. It's something you have to still try to do and try to do and try to do and hope that the scale eventually pushes back in another direction. And so this kind of his work as a whole sets up to tell the reader how the modern world, and America specifically, came to develop into what it currently is now. And there's no better depiction of what America is and where it currently exists than in the terminally online, highly infantilized, permanently surveilled populace that we have as a country. We've all retreated from public life to live in public in a completely different way, in a way that's like fake and controlled and stage managed through a lot of different things. And in a way that kind of represents sort of capitalism and the capital T they winning to a degree. It's depressing, but it's also a very accurate depiction of reality. We obviously get another reference to the hole at the top of the worlds that gets brought up a lot in his post Gravity's Rainbow work in this chapter. But I just something about the way that this whole scene was depicted in that first paragraph, like puts together a lot of the things that Pynchon in his late work is really focusing on and talking about. So that's the giant sort of tangent that this quote sent me down for like half a day.
A great analysis of that paragraph. I mean, that's yeah.
The other flaneur was named Naphtali.
That's right. Yes.
Which does apparently translate to my struggle.
Interesting.
I'd heard it at some point for some reason, but yeah. Thematic alignment with names. It's almost like Thomas Pynchon wrote this book.
Weird.
Crazy. And sort of like, as it continues to go on, you get this line here that says, the Fed sympathizers, other forces unknown who had their eye on the site to install a backdoor also. As easy as that. There goes the neighborhood. Talking about like the internet as a living space similar to the real world, as we've talked about a lot through this book. That quote definitely also applies just as easily to gentrification, which has been constantly in the background of this book, and just drawing up the similarities between these two societies, one online, one in person. It's really just showing how these things that the dark gods of capitalism, as he puts it, they do it everywhere. There's no refuge from it. What is done in real life can easily be done online, and vice versa. It's a really good just sort of opening section of this whole chapter. She kind of continues to go through different aspects of the deep web until eventually she sort of ends up on a weird alternate reality Star Trek ship, one where quite a rager has been held at some point. They have a lazy boy recliner. There's a bunch of stuff covered in cigarette burns. There's a bunch of posters of Denise Richards,
Very
Scotch
dated
tape,
posters.
Bulkhead. Nate Dogg and Warren G are playing out of the speakers. Really interesting stuff. And
Oh, and the more cowbell shirt too. We can't forget that.
yes, absolutely. A quintessential SNL sketch from the 90s.
Yes.
Very important stuff. And then eventually he runs into Lucas, and Lucas basically says, yeah, we went open source with it. We just sort of put it out there. There was no reason for us not to do it after what had happened with the random number generator, and this was really the only way that we could feel comfortable about it. And so he says that maybe the money was never an option, and we'll just have to keep on being working stiff. And then we get into this sort of very interesting kind of end piece where she goes to the windows of the spacecraft and kind of looks out, and then we get a reference back to that sort of hole at the top of the world. Do we have any thoughts on this section with the spaceship and what she sort of views out the window? Any extended thoughts from anybody on that?
It's a fun section. I think it brings a lot of humor into it, kind of lightens up the tone. But I do like the shift at the end. I think it's, that return to the opening up at the top of the world is very, that comes up a lot in a lot of Pynchon stuff, especially with, Against the Day and stuff. But it also had me thinking about, because that stems from a lot of Norse sagas. And so that had been kind of going back to that and thinking about that sort of mythology that exists around that and how that can still be placed over a modern setting.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you talked about at the start of this chapter covers what I would have said about this particular scene, I guess. But I just want to put a footnote for listeners who didn't make the connection themselves. This is the California thing. This is where it went. California created Silicon Valley, which created, in the end, Deep Archer. And this is the lone remainder of material imagination, I guess, as is analogized as the Western expansion in Mason and Dixon and in Against the Day, the hole at the top of the world.
It is a very good quote. Yeah, I figured someone would probably pick that, so I'm not going to reach out about it. It's no, and I think it's really interesting as we've read a lot of Pynchon's later work, in particular for this podcast, sort of covering the stuff that's less talked about. There is a very real synergy to his later work that is not as present in his Gravity's Rainbow and prior work. Like a lot of these things have very similar references to one another. A lot of these things bring these elements back up together. It really feels like as he entered in that sort of late period of his career, fuck you, Michael Chabon. He does have a late style. He was trying to make these connections very explicit to the reader in a way that has been really enjoyable as we have read sort of these books in rapid succession to point those connections to one another, which just increases, my understanding and appreciation of his work as a whole.
Yeah, and it's more effective because of how subtly it's done.
Yes.
It would be really easy for a writer to really ham-fist this kind of thing and kind of hit you over the head with it. Like, remember when it was in this book? Remember when it was in this book? But we're just given these little clues, these little nods here and there of, just kind of a wink from a distance of like, hey, yeah, this could tie to that. This could tie to that too. And it could also be, this can connect to this. And it's left more to the readers to put those connections together and start to put together how everything fits into each other. And I can't help but think that, you mentioned that it's indicative of his late style. Come at us, Chabon. But I can't help but wonder if that was a part of the I don't want to call it absence, but the time spent between Gravity's Rainbow and Vineland was, he's working on what we imagine, at least Mason and Dixon and Against the Day, these two huge works, but also finding a way to kind of tie everything together, not just thematically, but also through plot and through characters that intersect here and there. I think that there was a lot of careful consideration that that took place in the planning and structuring of these books before they ever, actually hit the printers and were given to us to read.
Yeah, I agree. So this opens up this sort of final phase of Maxine's time in Deep Archer in this chapter, where she interacts with a dead person. What do we feel about the presence of the dead people in Deep Archer through this phase of the book?
It felt to me like this is the modern day Thanatoid.
Mm,
The way they're described and the way in which they kind of aimlessly exist without existing at the same time. They're really nothing more than just this kind of digital shell with an image pasted over it, and they're just reminders of the people that have gone, and the people that are no longer there, and are only really accessible in this particular medium. They don't exist in the real world. They exist here in Deep Archer, for the people who are in Deep Archer and who have created them. I couldn't help but think of the Thanatoids, and whether there's some kind of a connection between the two, if the Thanatoids are just kind of the digital, or if these guys are the sort of digital Thanatoids.
it's an interesting thought I'd not had.
It reminds me, I guess, of the question that hasn't fully been answered, although at the beginning of this chapter we kind of want to believe it has. Or not the beginning of this chapter, kind of the beginning of the last chapter, I guess. Where Maxine gets a call from Reg, but there was a lot in the initial viewing of that Stinger missile footage that kind of indicated, like in the narration of it, that indicated that it might not have actually been Reg shooting the footage, and it might have been, but it might not have been. And all of these facsimiles of these fallen individuals in Deep Archer almost makes you wonder: was that actually Reg calling her? Did he actually shoot that, or is this somebody who's good at putting on a voice, who has studied his phone calls somehow? Mimicking Reg, because he doesn't show up again in the book.
Hmm. And is remarkably non-distinct about the interactions with his family, other than what he had for dinner with them. Yeah, that's a good point. Would support my theory that the video was created by Windust.
Yeah, and in service of the Thanatoid connection,
Mhm.
I think that this is a lot of the same stuff. I mean, Vineland, you're still talking about, it being set in the mid '80s. That is California, Hollywood, and Northern California in particular, where there's still the mystical redwoods. It was still the mythological place. That's where you go to get rich, was California. And if you're in California, you go up north to the redwoods, or further north to, Washington and Oregon, or even British Columbia, to escape the gentrifying forces. We have that same dynamic happening in a very, very real sense, where all the dead people, instead of being in Vineland, are in Deep Archer now, because that's where they
Hmm.
can inhabit. That's where they can be real, is in this fantasy land.
Yeah, no, I really like that interpretation. One of the lines from the kind of introduction to this section that I really like is no direct evidence, maybe only because she has 11 September on her mind, but everywhere now she looks, she thinks she sees bereaved survivors, perps, foreign and domestic, bagmen, middlemen, paramilitary, who may have participated in the day or are only claiming to have done so as part of some con game. This specifically brought to mind the fact that a lot of Sikh people got beat up in New York after 9/11 happened, and in one case, like, one of them was killed. That, like, this event caused some people to have, like, a bifocal for investigation everywhere they went. That was unfortunately targeted mostly in racist directions, but certainly was this idea that, everywhere we look, there could be another one of these, perpetrators amongst us. And that
Mhm.
Maxine herself is, she's looking at it from a governmental perspective because of everything that she knows, but is still doing the same thing. There's this sort of innate desire, to find who's responsible for it in a way that I think is articulated very well here. But I don't think I have anything else to add beyond what Will just said. Like that was great stuff.
Yeah, I got nothing.
I really do love the I guess not reappraisal, what's the word I'm looking for, but the reconfrontation, the image of the Archer. And I wanted to ask what everyone thought about that specific exchange. Where
I was going to ask the same question.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's something to it. I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, I mean, I was just gonna say that what we know about the Archer as an image, as an icon in the very real sense in this context is it was a splash screen made by this young woman, old girl, however you want to phrase her, that Lucas was seeing. And it seems like she didn't put any thought into it beyond just aesthetic. But the Archer has turned into this figure, this messiah almost in the deep web, and everybody seems, just based on this simple exchange of "You're the Archer? No, that one is silent," as though there's any lead up to it. So clearly this is something that is discussed a lot, or at least is on the mind of this particular individual, whether they're real and alive or real and dead, or some kind of artificial intelligence that's just autonomously walking around Deep Archer.
Mhm. Well, I think it has something to do with what their exchange is talking about, and maybe this is where it'd be profitable for the listener to read it out. Where she says, "Only here to look, find out how long I can stay at just the edge of the beginning before the word, see how long I can gaze in till I get vertigo, lovesick, nauseous, whatever, and fall in. You have an email address?" Maxine wants to know. "Kind of you, but maybe I won't come back. Maybe one day you'd look in your inbox and I won't be there. Come on, walk with me." They reach a sort of observation platform dangerously cantilevered out from the ship onto high, hard radiation. Vacuum, lifelessness. Look, whoever she is, she's not carrying a bow and arrow. Her hair isn't long enough, but Maxine can see she's gazing downward at the same steep angle, same space-wrapped focus at infinity as the figure on the Deep Archer splash page, gazing into a void incalculably fertile with invisible links. There's a faint glow. After a while, you notice it. Some say it's the trace, like radiation from the Big Bang, the memory and nothingness of having once been something. You're the Archer? No, that one is silent. I think that the fact that Maxine says, like, recognizes that she's not. She says, she says to herself, like, "Oh, her hair's not long enough. She's not holding a bow and arrow." But there is something in the quality of her face that also matches the Archer's face, and it is the fact that both of them are pointed towards this idea of infinity. And when we talk about what this woman or this avatar, dead or alive, if it is a dead woman, this is going to turn into maybe a conspiracy corner. We'll see. Where, there is this look back towards infinity that she's describing, that if you were able to do that, you could actually see back to the creation of the world, that because of how the physics of the universe work, that light is traveling from the origin point, which would be this explosion, the Big Bang that brought everything forth. And so there's this desire to return to that out of an interest in, probably restarting or holding in the palm of your hand, so to speak, the divine word that spake forth the universe. There's a reference there to the word, referring to this idea that in the Old Testament creation narrative, it's this divine word that God spake that created everything after it. And that was Eden. That was perfection. That was everything prior to the development of this sort of evil empire and everything that we've spent the last 2 hours talking about in context of these chapters and of Pynchon's greater work. That there is something in that search that you can see within a person to understand what the beginning of something was, to return back to the beginning of that thing and try and learn something from it, to potentially either take back to where you're at now or just live there instead of in this sort of like despoiled future world. That it's a quality in a person that you seek those things out rather than being that person itself, and that the archer is silent but calls people to engage in the same activity that the archer is engaging in. This look towards infinity, this look back at where, this, more perfect Edenic landscape may have come from that we can hopefully return to. And if we're looking at it maybe as a wholesale return of the dead, to go back to Sean's words, perhaps this is a suggestion from Pynchon's idea that when these people die, maybe he's getting into like a multiversal theory thing where like when you die, you are reborn into something else that you can return to, that perhaps this is an opportunity for you to return to that perfect state if you want to seek it out and do things better from the beginning this time and help balance out the scale better from wherever you go to. That's what I get out of these sort of quotes in this back and forth between her and Maxie.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much where I was landing on it as well. Just that idea of being able to. I was looking at it even more on a more macro level of just the idea of trying to take all of it, history in general, just rewind it and get back to the starting point and try it again to where we don't put ourselves in this situation, where we can be as good as we're capable of being and not get in our own way so much and not be so self-destructive to get us on, to the path that we're at now. That there is this sort of romanticized idea, I think, of being able to do that, and maybe that is the idea, is that on a more micro level, it's every individual person having that opportunity to go back and do their timeline again and make it right until there is that sort of cosmic balance that, obviously the ideal would be perfection, but maybe that's not attainable, and maybe we can at least get it to where there's a better balance in the scales.
Yeah.
So I don't want to come across as though I disagree with anything either of you have said, because I don't, and I don't think
Sure.
I don't say this to say you're missing something, because I don't think you are. Just to complicate it though, in the truest sense, the other person we've seen embody the archer in this way was the personal assistant, executive assistant, I don't know what his specific title was, of that banker that gave Maxine that speech about markets and about the new guard of Republicans, who was an Asian communist rapper who is not really an embodiment of any of these things except for the idea of infinity, or some kind of the most general sense of like conflict with success and ideals, I guess.
Yeah, maybe it's something in his ability to articulate historical racism and tragedy levied against a particular population of people, that it's in an understanding of that history, of that, like, pointing backwards towards infinity and understanding some aspect of it and the ability to articulate it, that brings that up. I don't know. It's an interesting way to complicate it, that I had not thought about prior to you bringing it up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it may have something to do with understanding some sort of contextual history, and that looking towards like the stars in that silent way that the archer is calling people to do the same and to understand your place and how things have come about and how those things have developed to be the way that they are.
It could even be, slightly more pessimistic interpretation, I guess. More of kind of like the essence of that, of the evil seed of modernism, as you referred to it earlier, is in that gaze. it is in that desire, whatever that is, to make right whatever that wrongness is,
Mhm.
whether it's in hindsight or it's in in the case of that assistant who was hoping to either become a successful communist rapper. I don't know how you become a successful communist rapper, but
You
or
try really hard.
yeah, I guess, or in his banking career, which is presumably what he ends up doing in the film.
Right.
That same gaze of wonder and desire to reach back or reach forward and to make these things right is that same germ of illness, despite the fact that it's inextricable from the best intentions of anybody.
Yeah. That certainly also, I would say, got some textual support. So back in meat space, as Pynchon puts it, Maxine calls Virva, and Virva shows up with a trash bag full of Beanie Babies. Seasonal! She cries, pulling out one by one little Halloween bats, grinning jack-o'-lanterns and witch hats, ghost bears, bears and capes done up as Dracula. Ghouliand, the girl ghost. See, with the little pumpkin, isn't she cute? Yes, something slightly manic about Virva this morning. The east side, to be sure, can have this munch kinetic effect on people.
Great portmanteau.
Yeah, it's great. And so, over the course of this sort of conversation between Virva and Maxine, we figure out that that Virva has actually been sleeping with Gabriel Ice this whole time, and that it is really sort of her responsibility that they were not able to sell Deep Archer for any money, and that instead they had to go open source with it. And that we get this really funny story before she fully reveals that information that uh, the boys were at a bar and they ran into Ian Longspoon again from Voorhees Kruger, and that Ian Longspoon came in with Gabriel Ice. And I'm trying to find the quote of what he looks like.
He had
So
a
stupid.
compact individual in Oakley M frames and a neon avocado lounge suit.
Yeah, what an outfit. And so they decide that that after overhearing a conversation where it seems like they're using a lot of words starting with J and T and passing a cocktail napkin back and forth to one another, that they may be attempting to kill them, and so it's best that they just remove any motivation to do so now by releasing it to the public instead of continuing to hold on to it for so long. Any thoughts on this back and forth? I think it's interesting how it just sort of comes out of nowhere that Virva and Ice have been sleeping together, and then it seems to be, you know, just another example of the seduction of a powerful man, is similar to Windust and Maxine, although from like a different perspective.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily comes from nowhere. Because we get later at the end of the chapter, we kind of understand why Verva confesses to it. There's that guilt that she's got racked up,
Yeah,
that causes her to confess it. I think the idea of her having an affair with Gabriel Ice, that kind of comes out of nowhere.
yeah, that's what.
Um, That's so. Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I like the scene with the boys and him. It's just a fun little,
They're hiding in like a back room,
yeah,
like
basically just like peeking out. Like, what are they saying? I
Yeah.
hear a lot of J's, and I think there's, yeah. It's just it's a goofy, fun little comedy scene that
it is.
yeah, I just enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And Ian Longspoon's a great name.
It is. Yeah.
Well, and I wanted to make a weird, again, very, very unsupportable hypothesis on the interpretation of this. I think that the idea of J and L, referring to Justin and Lucas, I think is pretty clear.
Mhm.
But also the fact is that capital J's, L's also look a lot like eyes, and just in terms of the context of trying to get the Deep Archer source code and the algorithms that run it, those are all the kinds of variable symbols that you would use when you're doing like high level discussion of this kind of algorithm.
Mm.
IJKL, etc. And they're not looking at the napkins; they're looking at CCTV footage of napkins. So it would be very reasonable for them to mix up a J for an I or an L for there are numerous other interpretations of the J and L, whether it's ice long spoon and the J, the I is just a poorly written J or whatever, that kind of
Yeah.
not what's the word I'm looking for? That kind of obscurity, I think, has to be considered.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I didn't think about that at all. So that's good additional detail.
Also, we skip past this because it's not relevant to anything. But the mention of King Kongs, which are Crown Royal plus banana liqueur.
Hmm.
A, does anyone know if a King Kong is a real drink? And B, has anyone ever tried Crown Royal with banana liqueur? Because
It's
that
not
actually sounds
called
okay.
that, but it's a real drink.
It is a real drink. I do not
Yeah.
want to try. I don't drink anymore, but I did enjoy Crown Royal quite a lot. I hate anything banana flavored. I don't like bananas, so that's an automatic no for me.
The Pinch on Wiki has it listed as being called something else. But it's just like
A
it-
rock star. What it's called.
yes, but what's befuddling me is that artificial banana flavor, which this liqueur would almost certainly have in it,
Hmm.
is never good.
No.
It doesn't taste good at all. And so why you would want to add that to Crown Royal is just really beyond. Well, any more chapter 33 thoughts from anyone?
I did. I liked at the end the kind of explanation that Verva gives. Not the explanation. Sorry, the dialogue that she has, where she's kind of expressing the guilt that she feels and is extrapolating it out to having some kind of accountability for what happened on September 11th, where she feels like if nothing else, obviously she's not directly responsible for it, but there's a level of carelessness that exists that lines up with it in her mind, which then she kind of goes on into a nice little quote that I'll read here real quick on 363. Same kind of carelessness, isn't it? Same as what? Is this the listen up all you slackers speech? American neglect of family values brings Al Qaeda in on the airplanes and takes the trade center down. They saw how we are, what we've become, how soft, how neglectful, self-indulgent. They figured us for an easy target, and they were right. Yeah, it's just like that level of awareness that Verva has, like in trying to process what she's done and kind of reckon with it. Even though she's obviously grossly over exaggerating the impact of her affair. I think she has a valid point with what she says in that passage that I just read.
Yeah, very good observation there too, Cody.
I find the whole last couple pages of it both obviously grim as as that quote condenses, but
Mhm.
also just very fun outside of that grimness. I think there's some questionable aspects to Daytona in this scene,
Mhm.
Yeah.
but I don't have anything specific to say other than just it's I do think that everything around that is funny, especially the New York citizenship exam.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry, Big Apple citizenship exam.
mhm. You are correct in there is, even though what she's talking about is ultimately pretty horrifying from the standpoint of giving herself over to Gabriel Ice, who's just this really awful person. It is still a fun couple of pages, despite the actual subject matter.
Yeah.
The way the whole thing is written is very funny and has a genuine sense of entertainment to it.
Yeah, and you have Maxine's her own insecurities about aging and becoming the stereotypical Yenta, leading into her thoughts about Virva. with just the line Virva, though technically Shiksa, lets them go on, drifting in and out in a motherly way.
Yeah. She is a Yenta. She doesn't want to be one, but time and time again, she proves herself to have the qualities of one.
Especially in the way that she thinks about being one so much.
Yeah, true. That's the true indicator. And so I'd say that probably closes out our discussion on 31 through 33. Did we have any funny parts we wanted to go over that we didn't talk about as we covered the chapters?
At the very end there is the adulteress. Oh, come on. Adolescentress. Just a good little joke.
Yeah.
And I gotta, credit Pynchon with reminding me of Comet Cursor for the first time in a very long time.
Oh god, that's true.
Yeah.
I meant to bring that up and I completely forgot. Yeah, that's a real bygone relic. Do you want to explain what that is, Will?
Oh, I mean, I wasn't really around when it was a thing. It was a mouse cursor customization program that was mostly used for distributing malware, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, eventually, yeah, but it was for a while. Companies could have fun little custom cursors on their own websites.
There in the same section as Comet Cursor reference is just the entire concept of trying to use Santeria to attack Gabriel Ice is just deeply funny.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, does that bring us to quotes?
I think it does.
Okay. Anyone in particular feel compelled to go first?
I don't mind going first. Mine's kind of a long one. It is at the beginning of chapter 33 when Maxine goes back into Deep Archer through the so-called back door. So that 11 September window of vulnerability Lucas and Justin were so worried about, for good reason apparently, has allowed not only unwelcome guests to sneak in, but somebody, Gabriel Ice, the feds, Fed sympathizers, other forces unknown who have had their eye on the site, to install a backdoor also. And easy as that, there goes the neighborhood. She clicks away, reaching it like the strange, creepy nimbus like a follow spot in a club, where you know you'll get sick before the evening ends, has a moment of doubt, ignores it, clicks on into the heart of the nauseous blur of light, and then everything for a while goes black, blacker than anything she's seen on a screen before. When the picture returns, she seems to be traveling in a deep space vehicle. There's a menu for choosing among views, and switching briefly to an exterior shot, she discovers it's not a single vehicle, but more like a convoy. Not quite simply connected, spaceships of different ages and sizes moving along through an extended forever. Heidi, if asked, would say she detected some Battlestar Galactica influence. Inside, Maxine finds corridors of glimmering space-age composite, long as boulevards, soaring interior distances, sculpted shadows, traffic through upwardly thickening twilight, pedestrians crossing bridges, airborne vehicles for passengers and cargo busily glittering. Only Coat, she reminds herself. But who of all these faceless and uncredited could have written it, and why? Popping up in midair, a paging window appears, requesting her presence on the bridge with a set of directions. Somebody must have seen her log. That's just such a cool, just beautifully written description of that entrance through there.
Yeah, I agree. I also just what a cool version of what the internet could be like that he depicts in this book. My quote also comes from 33 on page 357. Maxine continues to wander corridors for a while, striking up conversations at random, whatever random means in here. She begins to pick up a chill sense that some of the newer passengers could be refugees from the event at the Trade Center. No direct evidence, maybe only because she has 11 September in her mind, but everywhere now she looks, she thinks she sees bereaved survivors, perps foreign and domestic, bagmen, middlemen, paramilitary, who may have participated in the day or only claiming to have done so as part of some con game. For those who may be genuine casualties, likenesses have been brought here by loved ones so they'll have an afterlife. Their faces scanned in from family photos, some no more expressive than emoticons, others exhibiting an inventory of feeling ranging from party euphoric through camera shy to objectively gloomy, some static, some animated in GIF loops, cyclical as karma, pirouetting, waving, eating or drinking, whatever it was they were holding at the wedding or bar mitzvah or night out as when the shutter blinked. Yet, it's as if they want to engage. They get eye contact, smile, angle their heads inquisitively. Yes? What is it? Or problem? Or not right now, okay? If these are not the actual voices of the dead, if, as some believe, the dead can't speak, then the words are being put there for them by whoever posted their avatars. And what they appear to say is what the living want them to say. Some have started Weblog. Others are busy writing code and adding it to the program files. And then that kind of transitions into the part that we talked about with the departure person. I wanted to pick that quote because not only is it, again, like pretty beautiful writing, those always make up the bulk of the quotes that we actually read out on the show, but it's that last paragraph, specifically that if these are not the actual words of the dead, if as some believe the dead can't speak, then the words are being put there, so on and so forth. I picked that because if these are all the victims of the Trade Center attack, then it is very easy to understand that Pynchon could be making a comment about how victims of something are utilized for their own purposes, and that it is people using them to speak for them rather than their experience meaning something that it comports with truth. The way that those 3,000 people that died in the Trade Center were used as a justification for so much war, so much death, so much destruction, and then the way that other events are called hoaxes because of the lack of corpses, or because those things seem suspicious. It's this idea that like the dead are all innocent, as Sean said. You can't not be innocent when you're dead, but are oftentimes used by non-innocent people for non-innocent means. And it's just such an interesting depiction of that, and how the movement allows these things to live on in a way that wasn't the case prior. That your Facebook profile can stay up and be memorialized, and that is the case where you are interacting with a dead person in that internet space. Or
Mm-hmm.
if you're someone who runs a Twitter profile and you die and no one deleted it, you can still go back and like read all those different thoughts. You can still experience that. You can still experience the likeness of that person. But at the same time, sometimes when people die, there are other people who use that death to their own means and manipulate what that person may have said or may have meant for something completely different.
Definitely.
Well, so I have a gripe, and it is that
Uh-oh.
you stole my quote. The back in meat space paragraph.
Oh, sure.
Because not just is it so funny, but it is also like it's almost like a crazy poetry piece. Because there are so many like weird rhymes within the sentences. And I love the cadence of it, even though it doesn't quite line up as like a formal piece of poetry. So I guess I will do what I'll pick the quote that you intentionally didn't read out. Also on 357, a little earlier, more like out on expedition exploring. When the earliest Vikings started moving into the northern oceans, there's one story about finding this huge fucking opening at the top of the world, this deep whirlpool that'd take you down and in like a black hole, no way to escape. These days, you look at the surface web, all that yakking, all the goods for sale, spammers and spielers and idle fingers, all in the same desperate scramble they like to call an economy. Meantime, down here, sooner or later, someplace deep, there has to be a horizon between coded and codeless, an abyss. For all the reasons that we talked about earlier, it's a beautiful encapsulation of a lot of things.
Yeah, that's a really good.
Yeah, it's really, really good stuff. It's really good Pynchon book. It's the reason why it's one of my favorites.
Yep.
Well, we have some listener correspondence. Two people reached out to us on Instagram. Cody, do you want to read the one from Kenny?
Yes. So Kenny reached out to Luke on the Instagram. Who Luke? Unfortunately, we lost him earlier in the episode. His technical difficulties. But he said, really enjoying your podcast. I'm reading Bleeding Edge at the moment and going through it with you as my chaperones. Only started reading Pynchon last year, and I'm enjoying every word. Peace and love from Scotland. Thank you, Kenny. That's awesome. I've got a couple of friends that live over in Scotland, and I've been trying to get them to read Pynchon as well, but haven't had any luck. So, but I'm glad you're enjoying it, and I'm glad you've come to discover his work, and hopefully we can continue enhancing your experience with everything that he's done.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely message.
Yeah, he recommended The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, which I've heard Nan Shepherd mentioned before, and I've always been meaning to get into Scottish literature, so I'll definitely check it out. Thank you for the recommendation, Kenny.
As always, we are available for correspondence at Mapping the Zone Pod on Instagram. We're on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We are also, of course, on YouTube at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And you can send us an email directly if you should feel so compelled by emailing mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We'll be back next week for chapters 34, 35, and 36. After that, we are only going to have 2 more episodes to go, so there's 3 left in total before we hit the wrap-up episode. So thank you, of course, for listening as always. If you like what we do, if you think our show's worth $1, then we'd love to have it. We have a account with Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone, where you can just send a one-time donation. Any money that you send to the show will be used to upgrade equipment and pay our hosting fees, and just help make the show better in general. But of course, it is only out of any of your own discretion. We are doing just fine. Yeah. So until next week, thank you for listening. We'll see you when we discuss 34, 35, and 36.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I forgot to mention this earlier.
Uh-oh.
But maybe it would be a good thing to add just to the show notes as a one of the recommended pieces of media.
Sure.
There's that section that we were talking about the Archer as a concept, and I got lost in thought, so I didn't mention it. If anyone really loved that kind of general, almost like meta epistemological kind of thinking, When We Cease to Understand the World is a fantastic kind of exploration of that in the context of like semi nonfiction memoirs of the people who brought us particle physics and modern day mathematics.
Interesting.
I read that a couple months ago now. I really loved it.
I will add it in there. Shit, you know what? Now that I think about it, another Pinchonian comedian that we just lost, Bob Newhart.
You think so?
Oh yeah. Have you listened to his not his shows? The Newhart, the shows were a little bit different, but his stand-up from the 50s and 60s, it is very different. It's way ahead of its time too. A lot of one-sided conversations and a lot of wordplay. I'd have to go back, and it's been a minute since I've listened to it, but off the top of my head, just some of the bits that I'm remembering of his, I could see Pinchon being very into it.
Yeah, I can't say I've heard a stand-up.
Yeah, a lot of really dark stuff, if I remember correctly.
Very dark, yeah, and a lot of it is him. You're only getting one side of a conversation that he's having, by himself. And yeah, there's a lot of. It's good. Go listen to like his first 2 stand-up albums. I think you'll dig them.
I genuinely thought that guy just wasn't gonna die.
Right?
It felt like it.
He's 94.
Yeah, he hung in there for a long time.
Also, go listen to fucking Kim Gordon's record.
God, that new album is so good.
Really good stuff.
Really good.
Really good stuff.
And
super, super different from anything else she's released, and also very relevant to this book.
If someone told me 20 years ago that Kim Gordon was going to put out an album of trap beats with noise over it,
yeah,
I would have not known what to do with that information. But that's an amazing album. And I just found out the other day, Bratmobile is putting out a new album, or they're remastering something. They're doing something, bringing them back. So Bratmobile is a fucking awesome band too.
Bratmobile, Veruca Salt, Bikini Kill, La Tigre. Really, really awesome stuff. One of my favorite modern Riot Grrrl bands called Mommy Longlegs.
I've heard of them. I need to listen
really
to
fun.
Them.
Really fun. Really, really fun. Yeah, there's a lot of really good Riot Grrrl music. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Cody. I would not have assumed that Kim Gordon was going to release a spoken word trap beat noise album about the
And it's
internet.
really good.
That is not. And that it all works very, very well.